The robot nurse didn't belong there, and Dr. Hargrove knew it within the first 72 hours. Senior Chen moved through Mercy General's night shift like someone who had already survived worse than fluorescent lights and beeping monitors could inflict. She arrived at 10:48 p.m. on a Tuesday, her scrubs fitted but unremarkable, her badge clipped to a lanyard that had seen better decades. The ER hummed its usual midnight rhythm, the ventilator in Trauma Bay 2 wheezed its mechanical breath, a nurse's shoes clicked against the tile floor somewhere near the admitting desk, the automatic doors hissed open to swallow another ambulance run. Sarah hung her jacket in her locker, the navy cotton showing wear at the collar and cuffs, the kind of wear that came from years rather than weeks. Nobody noticed the faded patch sewn into the jacket's interior lining. It was too small, too hidden, too deliberately placed to catch anyone's eye. That was the point. She moved to the charge nurse station with the economy of motion that came from muscle memory etched across 18 years. Not 18 months. 18 years. Her hands were steady as surgical steel as she pulled the night roster and began her pre-shift chart reviews, reading through the admission notes with the kind of methodical precision that should have been invisible but wasn't, not to everyone. Mercy General's ER at midnight was a study in controlled chaos. The automatic doors cycled open and closed like the lungs of some great wounded animal. The intercom crackled with routine overhead pages. Somewhere a patient in the waiting area was arguing with a triage nurse about wait times. Sarah absorbed all of it without lifting her eyes from the charts, her fingers moving down columns of supply inventory notations, flagging entries that didn't align. That was when she noticed. The numbers didn't match. Not catastrophically, that would have been sloppy, and Dr. Hargrove wasn't sloppy. But the discrepancy was there if you knew what to look for. 14 units of midazolam ordered against 6 documented uses. 23 doses of hydromorphone recorded against 9 actual patient administrations. The pattern repeated across 3 weeks of medication logs, the kind of careful, methodical theft that suggested someone understood hospital accounting systems well enough to hide the bleeding. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. Just once, she allowed herself that reaction. Then her face went flat again, her expression the kind of careful neutrality that came from years of not showing anything that could be used against you. She closed the chart and looked up. Dr. Marcus Hargrove was watching her from his office across the ER. He stood behind floor-to-ceiling glass, a $12,000 Rolex visible on his left wrist as he straightened his tie. 63 years old, cardiologist by training, ER director by appointment, and every inch of him screamed old money and older privilege. His office smelled like mahogany and air freshener trying to mask the sharp chemical stench of ambition. Sarah had never been inside, but she'd seen the framed photographs, Hargrove at a country club, Hargrove at a medical conference in Cabo, Hargrove shaking hands with hospital board members whose names appeared in the society pages. He was staring at her with the expression of a man who'd just realized there was a problem on his floor. Sarah turned back to her charts. The night shift progressed with the rhythm of a metronome. By 12:17 a.m., she'd completed her initial rounds, checked on the patients in the acute care beds, verified ventilator settings, and documented 3 for starts with the precision of someone who'd done this exact sequence more times than most people drew breath. Her hands moved without hesitation, the tourniquet applied with the right tension, the vein found on the first attempt, the catheter threaded with the kind of practiced confidence that suggested this wasn't her first rodeo. It wasn't even her 1000th. One of the other night nurses, a woman named Jessica who'd started at Mercy General about the same time Sarah had, watched from the hallway. "You're fast," Jessica said. Not as a compliment, exactly. More like an observation. Most new hires take a few weeks to get comfortable with the workflow here. Sarah secured the 4 with a piece of tape, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd performed this task while helicopters thundered overhead and mortars shook the ground. "Just trying to be efficient," she said. Her voice was quiet, deferential. The voice of someone who took up as little space as possible. Jessica nodded and moved on. The ER continued its midnight symphony. A stretcher wheeled past, the metal frame creaking under the weight of a patient with chest pain. The heart monitor in bed 6 beeped its steady rhythm, 70 beats per minute, sinus rhythm, normal. In the trauma bay, someone was ordering a chest X-ray. The smell of antiseptic hung thick in the air, that particular hospital odor that was equal parts cleaning solution and desperation. Then the ambulance doors burst open. The paramedics came through in that controlled rush that meant something serious but not immediately catastrophic. 42-year-old male, admitted with syncope, the lead paramedic called out. Vitals initially unstable, now responding. Oxygen sat 94 on high flow. Captain Marcus Chen, Navy Medical Corps, reported some palpitations before the episode. Sarah's head came up. Not because of the patient's naval affiliation, Houston saw its share of military cases, nothing unusual about that. But something in the way the paramedics were handling him, the deference in their voices despite his obvious discomfort, suggested this wasn't a routine admission. Captain Marcus Chen was admitted to Bed 7, a corner room with better sight lines and quieter ambient noise. He was conscious, alert, irritable in that particular way of military personnel who weren't accustomed to being the patient rather than the person in charge. His uniform was still draped over the chair beside his stretcher, navy dress blues, the kind that meant he'd been coming from somewhere official. Sarah was the nurse assigned to his initial assessment. She approached the bed with her hand steady, her expression neutral, her posture the careful deference of someone trained to make themselves small. "Captain Chen, I'm Sarah. I'll be managing your care tonight. Can you tell me when the palpitation started?" The captain looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. His eyes were sharp, the eyes of someone trained to read situations and people with tactical precision. "About 2 hours before I collapsed," he said. "Irregular rhythm, chest tightness. Nothing I haven't felt before, but it was worse." Sarah was already checking his current vitals, the monitor showing a heart rate of 88, still slightly elevated. She documented the information with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this was muscle memory, not newly acquired skill. Her fingers didn't tremble as she recorded his history. Her voice remained level and professional as she asked the routine questions. But her mind was cataloging patterns, assessing severity, calculating risk. The way his left shoulder was positioned suggested old scar tissue. The way he watched her hands work suggested he recognized something in her movement. Neither of them acknowledged it. Across the ER, Dr. Hargrove had stepped out of his office and was moving toward the nursing station. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm, the kind that held the hospital's administrative records. His movements were smooth, confident, the movements of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged in any room he entered. He saw Sarah completing Captain Chen's intake assessment. He saw the way her hands moved with that unsettling precision, the way the captain's eyes tracked her movements with obvious interest rather than the casual attention most patients gave their nurses. He saw the small, barely perceptible tension in her shoulders when she noted the medication discrepancies in the chart, the ones she'd been cataloging all week. Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just barely visible. He smoothed his tie again, an unconscious gesture, the kind of thing powerful men did when they'd recognized a problem they would need to eliminate. In Bed 7, Captain Chen watched the nurse work, his sharp eyes missing nothing about her movements, the military precision of her motions, the way she carried herself like someone who'd made life and death decisions before breakfast. Something about her was familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. Something about her suggested that whatever had brought her to Mercy General's night shift, it wasn't because she needed the job. It was because she'd needed to disappear. Sarah finished her assessment and turned to leave, and that's when the captain spoke. "You move like someone who's handled combat casualties before." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough that anyone paying attention would have noticed. Then she turned back to face him, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "Combat experience isn't required for emergency medicine, Captain," she said. Her tone was perfectly professional, perfectly deferential, perfectly designed to discourage further conversation. But her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds before she looked away. In those 2 seconds, something passed between them, some recognition, some acknowledgement that there was more to the story neither of them was telling. The captain nodded slightly and said nothing more. Sarah continued her rounds, and Dr. Hargrove watched from across the ER with the expression of a man calculating probability and risk. He was already thinking about phone calls he would need to make, conversations about the new night shift nurse who asked the wrong questions about inventory and moved with the kind of precision that suggested military training. What happened next didn't just change the trajectory of the evening. It set in motion a series of events that would eventually bring the Pentagon to Mercy General's doors. But that was still several shifts away. For now, there was only the quiet hum of the ER at midnight, the steady beep of monitors, the careful choreography of people trying to heal the broken before the night could claim them. And a nurse named Senior Chen who'd survived far worse than this hospital could throw at her, moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors with the practiced calm of someone who'd learned a long time ago how to make herself invisible. The morning staff meeting began at 7 o'clock sharp, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps trapped in plastic. Dr. Hargrove stood at the head of the conference table in his tailored grey suit, the kind that cost more than most nurses made in a month, and surveyed the assembled residents, nurses, and technicians with the expression of a man who'd already decided the outcome of whatever announcement he was about to make. Sarah sat in the third row, her posture perfect, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She'd been at Mercy General for exactly 4 days. "I want to address something," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a politician before an election. "We have some new staff coming in, and I think it's important we maintain certain standards around here. Standards of engagement. Communication." He paused, letting his eyes drift across the room until they landed on Sarah. The smile that followed was the kind a shark might give to prey that hadn't yet realized it was bleeding. "So I'm taking bets. Who wants to give me odds that our new night shift nurse, the one who moves around like she's in a library instead of a trauma center, doesn't last a week? Anyone? I'll spot you 3-1. The laughter started in the front rows, small at first, then spreading like contagion through the room. Residents elbowed each other. A nurse in the back covered her mouth. The sound was the particular cruelty of institutional mockery, the kind that only works when everyone agrees to participate. Sarah took one measured breath. Her eyes remained fixed on the motivational poster behind Hargrove's head, something about teamwork featuring a faded image of geese in formation. Not one muscle in her face moved. Not a blink. Not a tightening of the jaw. Just absolute, measured stillness, as if the laughter was happening in a different room, in a different hospital, in a different life entirely. That afternoon, she sat alone at a corner table in the cafeteria with a simple turkey sandwich and a carton of milk, reading through a patient's chart she'd noted a discrepancy in, phantom billing for a procedure that hadn't actually been performed. She was so focused on the numbers that she didn't notice Hargrove approaching until he was already there, glancing back over his shoulder at his audience of residents and nursing students gathered near the food line. He was performing now, and every bit of his body language said he'd scripted this moment. He stopped at her table. She looked up. Then, with theatrical swagger that belonged on a stage rather than in a hospital cafeteria, he swept his arm across her lunch tray. The motion was smooth, calculated, designed for maximum drama and minimum chance of personal injury. Soup erupted across the table like a tidal wave. Her sandwich tumbled to the floor. The ceramic plate shattered against the tile with a sound like breaking bone. "Oops," Hargrove said, his voice dripping false concern. "Reflexes a little slow today, aren't they? That's concerning in a medical professional." He stood there for a moment, watching her face, waiting for something, a flinch, an anger, a breaking point. The entire cafeteria had gone silent. One single tear escaped down Sarah's cheek without permission, without warning, without her conscious control. But she wiped it away immediately with the back of her hand, moving with such casual precision that it looked like she was simply clearing away an annoying eyelash. Then she rose, stepped over the mess, and returned with paper towels and a trash bag. As she knelt to gather the shattered pieces of ceramic, her hands were completely steady. Not trembling. Not shaking. Just methodical, careful, the movements of someone who'd cleaned far worse than spilled soup in far more dangerous circumstances. She never looked up at him. Not once. 2 days later, during shift change when the ER was at its most chaotic, emergency room staff calling out reports, monitors beeping in overlapping rhythms, the constant hiss of oxygen flowing into ventilators, Hargrove stormed to the nurse's station where Sarah was updating medication records. He held a patient chart in his hand, and his face had the particular expression of someone who'd been looking for an excuse to cause a scene. Without a word, he hurled the chart at her feet. Papers scattered across the floor like confetti, individual sheets sliding under the desk, under the rolling computer station, across the tile. He stood there with his arms crossed, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to mirror shine. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice loud enough that half the ER could hear it. "If you're going to work in my ER, you're going to learn to do it right. Attention to detail. Protocol. Things that seem to escape you." The room's activity didn't stop, it couldn't stop. There were patients who needed care, but Sarah felt the weight of attention shifting toward her like a spotlight. She bent slowly, gathering each sheet with methodical care, stacking them into neat piles. She could hear her own breathing. Could feel the tightness in her chest that wasn't fear but something else entirely, the particular restraint that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing not to use it. When she rose, the scattered papers reassembled in her hands, she met Hargrove's eyes with devastating calm. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but carried the kind of weight that made the background noise of the ER seem to diminish. "I've had harder days than you can imagine, Doctor." The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove laughed, loud, mocking, the sound of someone who believed himself untouchable. He turned back to his audience of residents and made some comment about attitude problems that caused another ripple of nervous laughter. But in bed 7, visible through the partially open door of the patient room, the Navy captain had stopped pretending to read his magazine. He'd seen the exchange, not just seen it, but really seen it. The way she'd held herself. The way her voice had sounded when she'd spoken. The particular cadence of someone trained in discipline. He folded his magazine slowly and continued watching as Sarah walked past his room, carrying the patient chart with perfect posture, her face composed as still water. That night, after his shift ended, Hargrove made a phone call from his office. His pharmaceutical contractor answered on the 3rd ring. "We have a problem," Hargrove said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this problem was already being calculated, already being weaponized. "The new nurse, Chen, she's too detail-oriented. Too observant. She's looking at things she shouldn't be looking at. Start documenting everything she touches. Every medication she draws. Every chart she reviews. I need ammunition, and I need it fast." The voice on the other end agreed without hesitation. They had a relationship that stretched back 7 years and involved considerably more than just pharmaceutical sales. The connection was deeper than that. The connection was criminal. But Sarah didn't know about the phone call yet. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of Mercy General, hands on the steering wheel, staring out at the rain that had begun to fall across Houston in the late afternoon light. The raindrops created concentric circles on her windshield like spreading wounds. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let herself breathe. Just breathe. Just exist for one moment in a space where she wasn't invisible and she wasn't fighting and she wasn't constantly calculating 17 different exit strategies. The rain hammered against the car like applause for a performance no one was supposed to see. What they didn't know, what Hargrove didn't know, what the hospital didn't know, was that every insult he'd thrown at her, every cruelty he'd staged, had been absorbed into muscle memory that went back further than Mercy General, further than Houston, further than the life she'd carefully constructed out of silence and invisibility. The restraint wasn't fragility. It was the opposite. It was the particular calm that comes from having survived things that would break ordinary people into pieces. Rain hammered the ER entrance like machine gun fire. Thursday night, 11:08 p.m., and the waiting room was nearly empty when the doors burst open and 2 men in dark jackets moved through the corridor with the fluid precision of apex predators who'd done this before. No hesitation. No questions. They knew where they were going. Sarah was restocking the crash cart in Bay 4 when she heard the shouting. She didn't freeze. She didn't hesitate. She moved toward the sound instead of away from it, the way only someone who'd trained for this could move. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she rounded the corner and saw them, both armed, both moving with the methodical purpose of professionals executing a contract. The captain's room was down the east wing. Bed 7. The same bed where the Navy officer had watched her absorb Hargrove's cruelty 3 nights ago and said nothing. The lead gunman spotted her in the hallway. He didn't even slow down. "Get out of the way, nurse." Sarah stood in the center of the corridor. Her hands were steady. Her breathing didn't change. She was thinking in calculations now, distance, angles, how many seconds before security could respond from the west entrance. The answer was somewhere between 9 and 14. Not enough. "You need to leave," she said quietly. The second gunman raised his weapon. The motion was automatic, dismissive. She was an obstacle. Nothing more. He didn't know he was standing 3 feet away from someone who'd cleared compound rooms in Marjah with the same weapon, who'd moved through villages where the definition of non-combatant got rewritten every 5 minutes. He saw hospital scrubs and soft hands and assumed fragility. Wrong. She stepped left, placing her body directly in front of the captain's door. The gesture wasn't brave. It was tactical. It was what you did when you were the only barrier between someone you'd sworn to protect and people whose job was to remove them permanently. She'd made similar calculations with rounds coming downrange and the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through sand-thick air. "You'll have to go through me," Sarah said. The lead gunman didn't waste time negotiating. He raised his sidearm and fired. The sound cracked through the corridor like a whip, and Sarah felt the impact first as pressure, then as a white-hot bloom of pain across her right shoulder. The bullet tore through soft tissue and shattered the scapula, and she staggered backward 1 step but didn't fall. Wouldn't fall. She was still between them and the door. The second gunman fired. This shot came lower, punching through her abdomen just above the hip bone. The pain was enormous and geometric, a burning geometry that spread through her core like a wildfire through dry brush. She looked down and saw the entry wound pulsing dark red against white scrubs. The sight didn't paralyze her. It was information. Pain is data. Blood loss at this rate meant approximately 4 minutes before cardiac instability. Before her body couldn't keep her standing. She had 4 minutes. The gunman advanced. Sarah's hand found the defibrillator cart behind her, a 1,000-pound anchor of stainless steel and electrical components, and she yanked it sideways, blocking the hallway like a gate. The second gunman fired again. The third shot caught her in the left thigh, high up, and she felt the femoral artery tear before she saw the blood pour down her leg and pool on the linoleum in a spreading dark mirror. Rubber gloves snapped as a trauma nurse burst from Bay 3. An orderly was already on the phone with security. Sarah heard the words, "active shooter, trauma bay, officer down," and wanted to correct them, wanted to say the officer was fine, wanted to say she was just a nurse, just standing there, it was nothing, but the lie wouldn't work anymore. Her legs were starting to betray her. Shock was settling in at the edges of her vision like ink in water. The gunman didn't get past her. Security came through the east entrance at a full run, and the next 3 seconds were percussion and violence. 2 officers, trained and professional, and they moved like the military-grade security detail they probably were before they took hospital work. 1 gunman dropped at the corridor entrance. The second tried to return fire and caught a 9mm round through the chest that dropped him like a puppet with cut strings. It was over. The immediate threat was neutralized. The corridor went dead silent except for the sound of Sarah's breathing coming in shorter gasps and the wet sound of blood still moving across the linoleum. An orderly was shouting for a gurney. A nurse, the same trauma nurse with the snapping gloves, was already cutting away Sarah's scrubs, assessing the damage with the clinical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. 3 penetrating injuries, the nurse called out, her voice steady and fast. Right shoulder, abdominal entry at 2 centimeters below the right anterior superior iliac spine, left femoral wound with significant bleeding. She was applying pressure now, trauma pad soaked through in seconds. Call surgery. Tell them we're incoming with massive hemorrhage protocol. Type N cross. 2 units whole blood, activate the massive transfusion protocol. Sarah's vision was narrowing. The pain was becoming distant, a thing happening to someone else's body. She could see Hargrove standing 30 feet away in the observation window of Bay 2, watching her bleed with the kind of expression a businessman might wear while watching a stock ticker. His face had the flat, calculating quality of someone already thinking 3 moves ahead. His hand was already moving toward his pocket. She could see him making a mental note. This was opportunity. This was leverage. This was the final nail in her professional coffin. The gurney arrived. Hands, so many hands, lifted her onto it with a kind of coordinated gentleness that came from training, from knowing that rough movement could dislodge clots, could turn a bad situation into a fatal one. Sarah's vision was grey at the edges now. The fluorescent lights above her were blurring into one long white streak. How long to surgery? Someone asked. 2 minutes if we move. She felt the forward surge of momentum, the gurney wheels squeaking across the linoleum, the sound of her own breathing coming faster now, shallower. An oxygen mask appeared over her face. Someone was speaking directly into her ear, saying words meant to anchor her to consciousness. Stay with us. Stay with me. You're doing great. She wanted to tell them she'd done much worse than this. That this was just physics. Tissue damage and blood loss and the basic mathematics of trauma. She wanted to tell them about the time in Marjah when an IED had taken out the Humvee in front of them and she'd spent 90 minutes working on a Marine with a missing leg while taking sporadic small arms fire and knowing, absolutely knowing, that the bird wasn't coming for another hour. She wanted to say this was nothing compared to that. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the darkness that was waiting at the edges of her consciousness pull her down, down, down into the kind of sleep that felt permanent. The last thing she heard was Hargrove's voice, already smooth and urgent, already speaking to the police officers who'd moved into the corridor, his words coated with artificial concern. Officers, I'm Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Director of Emergency Medicine. What that nurse did was heroic, absolutely, but I need to be direct with you, she violated our evacuation protocols. She engaged those gunmen instead of evacuating the area. I've been building a performance case against her for weeks because of exactly this kind of reckless behavior. This is tragic, but it confirms everything I've been documenting. Sarah didn't hear the officer's response. She was already gone, already past the threshold into that grey place between heartbeats and breathing where the body goes when the damage is too large and the blood loss too fast and the only thing left is the mechanical persistence of anesthesia and the surgeon's steady hands moving through the dark. 2 floors above the trauma bay, in the ICU under federal protection, the Navy captain, the man who'd watched Sarah absorb Hargrove's cruelty with the kind of composure that belongs to people who've already seen the worst the world can offer, heard the commotion on the overhead speakers. Code Blue. Trauma activation. Incoming critical. He didn't know the details yet, but he knew her voice. He knew her posture. He'd been sitting in that bed for 48 hours watching the surveillance monitors they'd set up, and he'd seen her move through the hospital like someone who wasn't where she belonged, like someone who'd been filed away in some Pentagon basement and was living under an assumed identity in borrowed scrubs. He pressed the call button. When the FBI agent assigned to his protection detail appeared in the doorway, the captain was already sitting up, wincing against the surgical pain in his side. "Get me a secure phone," the captain said. His voice was military. Not a request. It was a command. "Sir, you're still in recovery. Now." The ICU at Mercy General ran on the hum of machines that didn't care about truth. Sarah's eyes opened to the sound of a ventilator cycling, mechanical, rhythmic, indifferent. Tubes ran from both arms. Bandages wrapped her shoulder, her abdomen, her thigh. The morphine drip kept the worst of it at bay, but she could feel the ache underneath, the deep muscular knowledge of trauma. 3 bullets. She'd known she was taking them before she moved. That had been the calculation: distance from bed 7 to the doorway, closing speed of the gunman, probability of ricochet through drywall. Her body was just the variable she'd offered. The oxygen monitor beeped steadily at 94%. Still breathing. Still here. 6 hours had passed since they'd wheeled her out of trauma surgery. 6 hours since Hargrove had begun his real work. 2 floors below the ICU, in the hospital's conference room adjacent to administration, Dr. Richard Hargrove spread a file across the mahogany table like a surgeon laying out instruments. The file was thick. Professionally bound. Fabricated in every detail. He'd spent the last 4 hours constructing it with the precision of someone who'd been hiding fraudulent billing for 18 months, which meant he understood documentation intimately. He understood what convinced people. He understood leverage. The 3 board members he'd called in owed him favors that ran deep. Board member Elena Torres, he'd buried a malpractice claim from 2019 when her husband, then chief of radiology, had misread a scan that led to a patient's delayed cancer diagnosis. The case never saw court because Hargrove had contacts at the insurance company. Board member David Pierce, his son had been arrested for a pharmaceutical DUI 2 years ago, and Hargrove had made 1 phone call to a prosecutor who owed him from an earlier favor. Charges dismissed. Board member James Whitmore, simply put, Hargrove had purchased his beach house through a shell corporation where Whitmore's embezzled country club funds had been quietly laundered. These men weren't criminals. They were respectable. They were terrified. He arranged the fabricated disciplinary reports in chronological order. He dated them carefully, backdated them to span 4 weeks. Written them in the administrative style that made lies feel institutional. Report 1, nursing staff observed Chen removing medication from trauma bay C without proper documentation, 2/14. Report 2, Chen observed accessing patient charts outside assigned care zone, multiple instances, 2/17. Report 3, Chen conducting an authorized inventory review in pharmacy storage, 2/19. Report 4, pattern of insubordination, questioning medical decisions, refusing to follow chain of command protocols, 2/21. There was no specificity because specificity could be challenged. The vagueness was the weapon. The weapon was plausible deniability. By 2 p.m., all 3 board members had received his calls. Elena Torres first. Elena, I needed to alert you to a serious situation before the board convenes. The careful use of her first name, the tone of regret. We've had to suspend a nursing staff member for multiple protocol violations. She engaged armed intruders instead of evacuating, heroic impulse, but reckless. It endangered staff. We need the board to stand united on this. A pause. I know you'll understand the importance of institutional stability during a crisis. David Pierce, David, I'm calling regarding a personnel matter. I've documented several incidents of insubordinate behavior from one of our night shift nurses. The situation became critical this morning when she took it upon herself to engage with security matters. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending investigation. I wanted you to hear it from me first. James Whitmore, James, I need your support on a board vote that's coming up. One of our staff has created a liability situation through reckless decision-making. I've got documentation. She'll likely claim she was acting heroically, but the board needs to see the pattern of behavior that led to this moment. By 3 p.m., all 3 had confirmed they'd vote as he directed. The system was holding. The system was working. Hargrove pulled the suspension notice from his desk drawer. He'd prepared it while Sarah was still in surgery, her blood still wet on the emergency room floor. He'd thought ahead. He always thought ahead. The notice was professionally typed, signed by Dr. Margaret Sanchez, the hospital administrator, who had no idea yet that she was signing it, but who would, because Hargrove had already called her with the narrative he wanted her to adopt. A patient was endangered by protocol violations committed by nursing staff member Sarah Chen during this morning's security incident. Investigation into employment irregularities and violation of code of conduct is underway. Staff member is suspended effective immediately, pending findings. No mention of the 3 bullets in her body. No mention of her positioning herself between gunman and a federal patient. No mention of the truth that lived in the blood spatter on the linoleum. Sarah was released from the ICU at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, 36 hours after taking the bullets. The orthopedic surgeon had cleared her for discharge to home care with conditions: no lifting, no bending, wound checks twice daily, pain management via medication, and physical therapy starting in 2 weeks. She'd moved carefully from the hospital bed to the wheelchair they required, each muscle remembering what had happened. The nurse, a young woman named Martinez who'd worked the night shift before Sarah's, had been kind. Martinez had actually met her eyes, which meant Martinez didn't know yet what Hargrove had done. That kindness was about to become complicated. The suspension notice was in an envelope at the discharge desk. White envelope. Black letterhead. The words arranged in administrative language that transformed heroism into liability. Sarah opened it in the lobby of Mercy General Hospital, standing still in her street clothes for the first time in 36 hours. The envelope felt heavier than paper should feel. She read it once. Twice. The words didn't change meaning. They only became more precise. Pending investigation into protocol violations and employment irregularities. That was Hargrove's phrasing. That was his precision. That was how he'd transformed her into a liability. She'd tried to tell them. Not right away, she'd been too compromised in the ICU, too medicated to articulate clearly, but to the discharge nurse, to the hospital social worker, to anyone who would listen. Dr. Hargrove has been committing billing fraud. Phantom procedures. Kickbacks from Biomed Solutions. I have documentation of medication discrepancies that don't match inventory records. I documented it all. The words came out in fragments because she was still healing, still on morphine that made everything feel distant and soft. The social worker, well-meaning, had taken notes. The social worker had nodded with the careful compassion reserved for patients whose trauma had made them paranoid. We'll make sure that information gets to the appropriate people, the social worker had said, which was the professional equivalent of placing something in a file where it would never be found. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the real blow. The army medic found her in the parking lot. Mitchell. The one who'd assisted during the emergency surgical airway on the captain, the one who'd whispered, "Where did you learn to cut like that?" when he'd watched her hands move through the procedure with muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing school. He was in civilian clothes, off shift, and he intercepted her at the elevator bank before she could reach the parking garage. Senior Chief. Not a question. A statement. A recognition. Sarah stopped. There was no point in running. There was no point in lying to someone who'd been trained to recognize what she was. But she couldn't, not here, not with hospital staff passing them in the corridor, not with her entire life about to blow apart. She just shook her head once, a small movement, and kept walking. Mitchell didn't follow her. He just stood in the hallway, watching her move toward the stairwell, his face carrying the weight of a question he already knew she wouldn't answer. The door closed between them. That night, it rained. The veteran cemetery in northwest Houston sat on 30 acres of land where the grass never died and the headstones all faced exactly east. Sarah's car pulled through the gate at 8 p.m. The rain fell in heavy sheets, the kind that turned the cemetery into something ancient and biblical. She knew where to go. She'd been here before, though not in a long time. Not since the funeral where she'd stood in her dress Navy uniform and shook hands with Navy wives and Navy officers and Navy chaplains while the rain fell that day too, and a bugler played taps, and her husband's flag was folded into a triangle that would have meant everything to him. The headstone read, Lieutenant James Chen, Naval EOD Technician, 1978 to 2018. Beloved husband. The date sat side by side. In between them, the entire architecture of a life that was supposed to be long and ordinary and full of normal things. Sarah knelt in the mud. The rain soaked through her jeans, her jacket, the bandages beneath her clothes that were still wet with drainage from her wounds. She placed her hand against the granite, and for a long moment, she didn't move. I tried, she whispered. The rain hammered around her like a question she couldn't answer. I tried to disappear like they ordered. Tried to be normal. Tried to just be Sarah the nurse, just another person in a crowd, nobody special, nobody dangerous. Her voice broke slightly, not in public, never in public, but alone here with the rain and the man who died because the operation that was supposed to be classified had gone sideways anyway. But I failed you. Again. I always end up bleeding. She reached into her jacket lining, where the needle and thread had held the faded unit patch in place for 4 years. The patch was worn, her old call sign embroidered on it in white letters, Valkyrie. She held it in her wet hands like it might dissolve. The rain fell harder, and Sarah Chen knelt alone at her dead husband's grave, a nurse with 3 bullets in her body and a suspension notice in her car, and tried to remember why she'd ever thought disappearing was possible. The ICU monitor beeped its steady rhythm at 2:24 a.m. when the Navy captain's eyes opened. Not slowly. All at once. Like flipping a switch from darkness to fluorescent light. His pupils dilated. His hand moved toward the call button, then stopped. Something on his bedside table caught his attention. A manila folder. His name printed on the cover. No. Not his name. Hers. Sarah Chen. Termination notice. Effective immediately. The captain's jaw tightened. His Federal Protection Detail, 2 agents in dark suits stationed outside his door, heard him before they saw him move. One hand yanking the four from his arm. The other reaching for the phone with the intensity of a man who'd survived 3 assassination attempts and wasn't about to lose someone who'd taken bullets for him. Get me the hospital administrator. Get me whoever runs this place. Now. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. And I want the federal liaison. This minute. Not in 5 minutes. This minute. The agents exchanged glances. The captain was fully alert. Fully aware. And fully furious. 48 hours later, the emergency board meeting filled the hospital's executive conference room on the 15th floor with the kind of tension that made the air feel pressurized. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the mahogany table, his 3 cultivated board members flanking him like sentries. His attorney occupied a chair to his right, leather briefcase positioned on the table like a shield. The FBI liaison sat across from them, her notebook closed but her eyes unblinking. The captain sat in a wheelchair, his daughter standing beside him with her hand on his shoulder. Hargrove smiled. A predator's smile. Gentlemen, I appreciate the urgency, but I'm sure we can clarify that Ms. Chen's actions were. The captain's daughter stood. She was 23 years old, pre-law at UT Austin, and she had her father's eyes. My father wants you to know you're firing Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen. Her voice didn't shake. Senior Chief. Not nurse. Not Ms. Chen. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy, retired. The room stopped breathing. A folder landed on the table. Not gently. The kind of impact that made pens rattle. The FBI liaison opened it with deliberate slowness. Her fingers turned the pages one by one, each one marking another piece of Sarah's buried life. 2 tours in Marjah. Operation designation still partially redacted. Unit assignments. Then a photograph, Sarah in dress blues, her collar insignia unmistakable. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Her jaw lined with the kind of focus that came from knowing you were responsible for keeping 17 people alive in Helmand Province while insurgents tried to end that equation with IEDs and RPGs. The next page stopped everyone's heart. Navy Cross. Citation read, for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. The words blurred together. Then it came into focus. Under intense fire, Senior Chief Chen performed emergency surgical airway procedures in the field with 0 medical infrastructure, 0 backup, and a 47-minute window before the nearest trauma facility. 17 personnel survived, direct result of her actions. Operation classified. Date classified. Location, Marjah, 2011. Hargrove's face went the color of old concrete. Purple Heart. The FBI liaison turned the page. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Each one landed like a gavel. And that's just the medals we've declassified for this meeting, gentlemen. The captain leaned forward. His recovery had given him back some of his military bearing, and he used it like a weapon. 3 bullets. Should have been for if she'd stepped aside. She didn't. The FBI liaison's voice dropped into that register that precedes institutional devastation. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, we've completed our investigation into your billing practices. Senior Chief Chen's warnings about inventory discrepancies and phantom procedure coding have been corroborated across the past 18 months. We've also traced your pharmaceutical supplier to a procurement fraud ring operating out of the Pentagon's acquisition division. The same ring Senior Chief Chen exposed in 2010, which resulted in her placement in deep cover operations. The same ring your supplier has been supplying to for the past 4 years. Silence. The kind of silence that precedes career endings. She didn't violate protocol the night of the shooting. She prevented a federal witness from being murdered. The liaison closed her folder. And she did it while you were already planning to destroy her professionally. Hargrove stood. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He shook it off. This is outrageous. This is a conspiracy. I was protecting the hospital from a security risk, I was. The security guard from the ER appeared at his elbow. Not menacingly. Just there. Holding a carton identical to the one he'd handed Sarah 3 days earlier. I believe you know the way out, sir. His voice was granite. Your building access has been revoked. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal items. Anything else stays. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. The 3 board members who'd cultivated him for a decade suddenly became very interested in their notepads. His attorney was already dialing. The FBI liaison didn't even look up from her paperwork. The security guard waited. Hargrove took the box and walked toward the door like a man moving through water. His phone began ringing before he reached the hallway. His contact at the pharmaceutical supplier. His board member allies. Each call a small severance from the life he'd built on other people's suffering. By evening, his supply chain contact had lawyered up and was cooperating with federal investigators. By the next morning, the outside investigator he'd hired to manufacture Sarah's incompetence was being interviewed by the FBI about who'd hired him and what he'd been told to find. By week 2, every thread of his operation had been pulled by someone else wearing a better badge. The news broke at 6 p.m. on every Houston station. Decorated Navy combat medic fired after saving captain. Now officially cleared. The photograph they used was from her Navy file. Sarah in dress blues. Jaw set. Eyes that had seen things the morning news anchors would never comprehend. Dr. Hargrove watched from his apartment, surrounded by boxes he hadn't packed, and understood that his life had become significantly smaller. 6 months later, the Oval Office hung with the kind of formality that only existed in photographs. The president stood beside Sarah Chen in her pressed dress uniform, the Navy Cross ribbon already on her chest, and reached for the medal itself. The weight of it. The significance of it. Sarah didn't blink as it was pinned to her uniform. The Navy captain stood in the front row, his daughter holding his arm, both of them with tears they didn't bother hiding. Behind them, a SEAL team leader in his dress whites, the man who'd led the operation that officially never happened. 3 of the 17 operators she'd kept alive in Marjah stood in uniform beside him, their ribbons stacked like evidence of the things they'd survived. The president shook her hand. "Thank you for your service." Sarah nodded once. Professional. The composure of someone who understood that gratitude and recognition were nice, but they didn't change the geometry of what had happened. 1 month later, she walked into Mercy General wearing the white coat of the Director of Emergency Medicine. The entire ER staff stood. Not applause yet. Just standing. Bearing witness. The Army medic from Bedford raised his broken arm in a half salute, a gesture that meant everything in the language of people who'd been hurt and healed. Sarah's new office was on the 3rd floor. She hung one thing on the wall, the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, now framed in museum glass. 17 stitches holding it together from when she'd sewn it in while sitting in a forward operating base, a small piece of identity she'd been allowed to carry as long as it stayed hidden. The Army medic knocked during her first week. He was the AS new trauma coordinator, promoted from patient to staff, his recovery complete. Was it worth it? He asked. Staying hidden all those years? Sarah's hand moved to the frame. The patch stared back. Faded olive drab. A small embroidered insignia that meant you'd been part of something bigger than yourself. I was ordered to disappear. So I did my duty. But some things you can't hide forever. Eventually, you are who you've always been. The uniform just makes it official. During her first staff meeting as director, the ER team filled the conference room. Nurses, residents, techs, housekeeping staff, the people who'd watched Hargrove humiliate her, who'd said nothing, who now couldn't meet her eyes. She waited until the silence became uncomfortable. What happened to me should never happen to anyone here. We protect each other. We trust each other. And we remember that healing isn't just what we do with our hands. It's how we treat the people beside us. That afternoon, a young nurse, couldn't have been more than 2 years into practice, dropped a patient chart in the hallway outside bed 7. Papers scattered. She knelt to gather them, her shoulders shaking with something that might have been fear or might have been exhaustion. Sarah knelt beside her without being asked. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Sarah's voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that carried weight. You just need to show up when it matters. The young nurse looked up and saw the Navy Cross ribbon on Sarah's white coat. Saw the woman who'd taken bullets for someone she barely knew. Understood. Really understood. Sarah stood and walked deeper into the ER, past the monitors beeping their steady rhythm, past the fluorescent lights that no longer felt sterile but somehow warmer. The place where she'd finally stopped hiding. Where the woman the Navy had classified finally got to be real. If you made it this far, you know why Sarah Chen matters. You know why we don't always see what's standing right in front of us. Subscribe for more stories about the people who save lives in the dark, and comment below, would you have fired her, or would you have recognized what Hargrove was too arrogant to see?